Good morning. My name is Ken Carroll. I am the Center Director in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity in San Francisco. I want to start by thanking Caroline and the staff of Fair Housing of Marin for planning this event. Looking at the agenda, it looks like it's going to be a very interesting, thought-provoking day. And I just want to acknowledge Fair Housing of Marin. And also, look at this crowd. It's amazing the number of people who are here and interested in learning about this issue and delving deeper into issues related to housing choice, equality, and affirmatively furthering fair housing. So Teresa and I will be giving you overviews of each of our respective agencies. I work for HUD. She works for the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. And we're also going to be giving you sort of the basics of federal and state laws that prohibit housing discrimination. However, since this conference is about sort of larger policy issues related to housing equality, choice, and affirmatively furthering fair housing, we thought it important to begin with a very abbreviated timeline on what brought us to the Fair Housing Act, and especially Section 808E5 of the Fair Housing Act, which is the Act's requirement that HUD programs be administered in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. So again, I work for HUD, which is a federal government agency, and at HUD I work in an office called Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, or FHEO. And I say this to emphasize that federal, as well as state and many local governments, now and for many years have been working to promote fair housing. But that has not always been the case. Prior to 1968, the federal government was in fact doing precisely the opposite. It was implementing tools that actually perpetuated discrimination and segregation. And an example of that was the federal government's early involvement in insuring home loans. On the heels of the Great Depression, most Americans couldn't afford to buy a house. So in the 1930s, the federal government began insuring home loans for people who were of more modest means. And they did this in order to encourage banks to make more mortgages. That was a good idea if you were white and you lived in a white neighborhood. Just about all home loans under federal programs at that time went to white Americans because the federal government would not insure home loans on properties that were in integrated or racially changing neighborhoods. The result of that is that whites could buy a home, they could become part of the middle class, and they could build wealth for themselves and future generations. On the other hand, similarly situated African Americans who did not have access to federally insured home loans could not buy a house, which made it harder to become part of the middle class and build wealth for future generations. And this disparity perpetuated discrimination, as well as neighborhood isolation and segregation. Many African Americans continued to live in substandard housing, and their neighborhoods were isolated, they were economically depressed, and they were limited in resources. Now, the federal government initially responded to this issue by funding local governments to build low-income public housing. And the federal government gave local governments the discretion to do this in ways that local governments saw fit. Many local governments would use the federal funds to bulldoze economically depressed African American neighborhoods and build large, high-rise, superblock public housing in their place. This housing was updated and clean at first, so it improved living conditions for a time. However, ultimately, it continued isolation, segregation, economic disparities, and it brought on additional issues. From 1965 to 1968, riots and urban unrest ensued in many American cities due to the pervasive discrimination and segregation of African Americans. In March 1968, the federal government released a groundbreaking report which found that, quote, pervasive discrimination and segregation in employment, education, and housing has resulted in the continuing exclusion of great numbers of Negroes from the benefits of economic progress. Then on April 4th, 1968, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. During his life, Dr. King pushed to have a federal fair housing law enacted. Dr. King recognized that where someone lives has a huge impact on all aspects of their lives, including their access to employment, education, healthcare, and transportation. So federal law needs to address arbitrary housing denials, as well as the government's role in perpetuating discrimination and segregation. So with all of this backdrop, just 1 week after Dr. King's assassination, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act does essentially two things. First, it outlaws housing discrimination. Second, it mandates that federal government-funded housing and community development programs be administered in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing, meaning that HUD-funded programs be administered in a manner that furthers integration, overcomes historic patterns of segregation, reduces racial and ethnic concentrations of poverty, and reduces disparities in access to community assets, such as education and employment. And it's this second piece, the affirmatively furthering fair housing piece, that was really meant to unravel the problems that were created by that prior bad federal and local government policy that promoted the discrimination and segregation. Now, that's the second piece as well that is going to be the focus of today. But to set the stage, Teresa and I were asked to give the basics on the outlawing discrimination piece that are part of the Fair Housing Act, as well as the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. So I am now going to invite Teresa to come up and talk about California Fair Housing Law and her agency's role in enforcing it. And actually, I have to acknowledge the state of California because well before the Fair Housing Act, California did have a state fair housing law.